After my wife passed away, I wandered aimlessly for a week. Counting the few dollars I had left for lunch, I found a cafe receipt from a place I'd never been to. On the back, it said, "Go to this address if you want to know the truth." I went there and came face to face with a billionaire when he revealed that I had an inheritance worth. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd become a stranger in my own home. But there I was, standing in the doorway of the house I'd lived in for 37 years, watching my son-in-law Clifford pack my belongings into garbage bags like I was some unwanted tenant who'd overstayed his welcome. The funeral had been 3 days ago. Margaret was gone, and with her, apparently, any claim I had to the life we'd built together. The grief was still raw, sitting heavy in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow, but Clifford didn't seem to care about my mourning process. "Dad, you need to understand," Leah said from the kitchen doorway, her voice strained but determined. She wouldn't look me in the eye. "This house has always been in Mom's name. Legally, it belongs to her estate now. I watched my daughter of 38 years speak to me like I was a business transaction that needed to be closed. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn to the funeral, and her face had that pinched expression she got when she was trying to convince herself of something she didn't quite believe. "Leah, sweetheart," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "This is our family home. Your mother and I bought this place before you were even born. You took your first steps in this living room." Clifford dropped one of my shirts into a bag with more force than necessary. "Look, Philip," he said, not bothering to hide his irritation. "I know this is hard, but you can't stay here indefinitely. Leah and I have our own lives to think about. We've got plans for this place." Plans. The way he said it made my stomach turn. I'd been living in this house for over 3 decades, and now I was being told about their plans like I was some obstacle to be removed. "What kind of plans?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Clifford exchanged a look with Leah. It was one of those wordless conversations married couples have, except this one felt calculated, rehearsed. "We're thinking about renovating," Leah said finally, "maybe turning it into something more modern. Mom's style was very dated. Margaret's carefully chosen antiques, her collection of blue china, the garden she'd tended for 20 years, all of it dismissed as dated." I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with grief. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Clifford shrugged, stuffing my winter coats into another bag. "You're 63, not 93. You'll figure it out. Learn to live alone for once." Learn to live alone. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been married to Margaret for 41 years. We'd met when I was 22 and she was 19, 2 kids who thought they knew everything about love and nothing about life. She'd been my partner, my best friend, the person who made every ordinary day feel like it mattered. "I just buried my wife," I said quietly. "And now it's time to move on," Clifford replied, not pausing in his packing. "Grief is a luxury you can't afford right now. You need to be practical." Practical. I stared at this man who'd been part of our family for 8 years, wondering when he'd decided I was disposable. Clifford was tall and lean, with the kind of sharp features that photographed well, and a smile he could turn on and off like a light switch. Leah had been so proud when she brought him home, so convinced she'd found someone who would take care of her the way I'd taken care of Margaret. Now I was beginning to understand what kind of care he had in mind. "Dad," Leah said, finally looking at me directly, "you'll be happier somewhere smaller, somewhere that doesn't have so many memories. This house is too big for one person anyway." Too big. This coming from my daughter who used to build pillow forts in the living room and beg me to read her stories every night before bed. The same daughter who'd cried when she left for college because she'd miss her childhood bedroom so much. I watched them continue packing my life into bags, moving with the efficiency of people who'd already made their decision and were just going through the motions of implementation. They'd probably been planning this for weeks, maybe even before Margaret died. The thought made me feel sick. By evening, they'd filled 7 garbage bags with my belongings, 7 bags to represent 63 years of life. Clifford loaded them into my old Toyota Camry, the one Margaret and I had bought 5 years ago when her sedan finally gave out. Even that felt like charity now, like they were letting me keep the car out of pity rather than any sense of fairness. "You'll be fine, Dad," Leah said as I stood beside the driver's door. She gave me a quick, awkward hug that felt more like a handshake. "Call us when you get settled somewhere." Somewhere. Like I was going on vacation instead of being kicked out of my home. I drove aimlessly through town for an hour, my belongings shifting in the back seat every time I turned a corner. The motels all looked too expensive or too depressing, and I couldn't bring myself to call any of our old friends. What would I say? That my own daughter had thrown me out? That I was now homeless at 63? Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. My stomach was empty, but eating felt impossible. Instead, I sat in my car and tried to figure out what had gone so wrong. Margaret had always been the one who handled our finances, our legal paperwork, the practical details of our life together. I'd been content to let her manage those things while I focused on my job at the hardware store. Now I wondered if that had been a mistake. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, I would have seen this coming. I must have dozed off in the car, because the next thing I knew, morning light was streaming through the windshield, and my neck ached from sleeping at an odd angle. I checked my wallet, $63.47, enough for breakfast and maybe one night in a cheap motel, but not much more. The diner was nearly empty except for a few truck drivers and early commuters. I ordered coffee and toast, counting out exact change like every penny mattered. Because now it did. That's when I found it. Tucked between my driver's license and an old grocery store receipt was a piece of paper I'd never seen before. It looked like a cafe receipt, but not from anywhere I recognized. The name at the top read Cornerstone Cafe in elegant script, and below that was an address across town. But it was the handwritten message on the back that made my hands shake. "Go to this address if you want to know the truth." I stared at the note, reading it over and over again. The handwriting wasn't mine, and it wasn't Margaret's either. It was careful, deliberate, written by someone who wanted to make sure every word was clear. But how had it gotten into my wallet? And what truth was I supposed to find? The logical part of my brain said it was probably nothing. A mistake, a prank, maybe something that had been passed to me by accident. But sitting there in that empty diner, with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, logic felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I finished my coffee, left a small tip, and drove across town to find out what truth someone thought I needed to know. The address led me to a part of town I'd never explored in all my years living here. It was the kind of neighborhood where old money lived quietly behind tall hedges and iron gates, where the houses were set so far back from the street you could barely see them. I drove slowly, checking house numbers twice, convinced I must have made a mistake. But there it was. A modest office building tucked between two elegant townhouses with Cornerstone Investigations etched discreetly into a brass plaque beside the door. My heart was pounding as I sat in my car staring at the building. This wasn't a cafe at all. Someone had wanted me to find this place, but I couldn't imagine why. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon. She looked up when I entered, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or relief. "You must be Philip," she said before I could introduce myself. I stopped in my tracks. "How did you—" "Mr. Donovan has been expecting you." She stood and gestured toward a hallway lined with dark wood paneling. "Please, follow me." Mr. Donovan. I'd never heard that name before, but apparently he knew mine. My legs felt unsteady as I followed the receptionist down the hall to a heavy oak door marked Private. She knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Philip Harrison is here," she announced. The office was impressive in an understated way. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that looked like it belonged in a museum, and windows that offered a view of a small garden behind the building. But it was the man behind the desk who made me forget about the decor entirely. He was probably in his early 70s, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His suit was expensive but not flashy, the kind of clothing that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. When he stood to greet me, I noticed he moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned long ago that presence mattered more than speed. "Philip," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I'm Thomas Donovan." His handshake was firm, and something about his voice made me feel like I was supposed to know him, but I was certain we'd never met before. "I'm sorry," I said. But I don't understand what this is about. I found a note in my wallet. Please, sit down. He gestured to one of two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. I know this must be confusing. Would you like some coffee? Water? I shook my head and sat down, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. Mr. Donovan, I need to know how that note got into my wallet and why you were expecting me. Thomas Donovan returned to his own chair and leaned back, studying me with those penetrating blue eyes. I've been looking for you for a very long time, Philip. Longer than you might imagine. Looking for me? Why? He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. What I'm about to tell you will probably sound impossible at first. But I need you to listen carefully, because your life, your real life, is about to begin. My throat felt dry. What are you talking about? Tell me about your childhood, Philip. Your earliest memories. The question caught me off guard. I don't see what that has to do with... Please, it's important. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I grew up in foster care. My parents died when I was very young. 3 or 4, I think. I was moved around quite a bit until I aged out of the system at 18. Thomas nodded slowly. And you never questioned the story you were told about your parents? What was there to question? They died in a car accident. I was told I had no other family. Even as I said it, something cold settled in my stomach. Why are you asking me this? He opened the manila folder and pulled out a black and white photograph. Do you recognize this man? I leaned forward to look at the picture. It showed a young man, maybe in his 30s, standing beside a woman holding a small child. The man's face was familiar in a way that made my chest tight, but I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. Who is he? His name was William Harrison, your father. I stared at the photograph, my vision blurring slightly. That's impossible. My father died when I was 3. No, Philip, your father died when you were 37 years old. He spent the last 34 years of his life looking for you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs and couldn't seem to get it back. That's not possible. You're mistaken. You have to be mistaken. Thomas pulled out another document, this one official-looking with multiple seals and signatures. This is a copy of your original birth certificate. The real one, not the falsified document that was filed when you entered foster care. I took the paper with shaking hands. There was my name, Philip William Harrison, and below it, information I'd never seen before. Parents listed as William James Harrison and Catherine Marie Harrison. Born in a hospital I'd never heard of, in a city 200 miles from where I'd grown up. I don't understand, I whispered. Your parents didn't die in a car accident, Philip. You were taken from them when you were 3 years old. The official records were altered to show that you had no living relatives, and you were placed into a foster care system under a false identity. The room seemed to spin around me. Taken? By who? Thomas's expression darkened. That's what your father spent decades trying to find out. He hired investigators, lawyers, anyone who might be able to help him track down what happened to his son. He never gave up believing you were alive somewhere. I set the birth certificate down on the desk because my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. Why would someone do that? Take a child and fake documents? Money, Philip. Your family had significant wealth, and there were people who stood to benefit if you disappeared. What kind of wealth? Thomas pulled out another document, this one more recent. It was a bank statement with numbers that made my eyes water. Your father was William Harrison of Harrison Industries. When he died last year, his estate was valued at just over $200 million. $200 million. I couldn't even process a number that large. That's impossible. I'm nobody. I work in a hardware store. I drive a 10-year-old Toyota. You're not nobody, Philip. You're the sole surviving heir to the Harrison fortune. Your father never remarried after your mother died. She passed away naturally when you were 15, still believing you would come home someday. He left everything to you. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're talking about some kind of conspiracy, like something out of a movie. Things like this don't happen to people like me. People like you? Thomas raised an eyebrow. You mean people who've spent their entire lives being told they don't matter? People who've been trained to accept less than they deserve? His words cut deeper than I expected. I thought about Clifford packing my belongings into garbage bags, about Leah refusing to meet my eyes, about spending the night in my car because I had nowhere else to go. Even if what you're saying is true, I said slowly, it's too late. My father is dead. The people who took me, they're probably dead too. What's the point of knowing any of this now? Thomas stood up and walked around the desk to face me. The point, Philip, is that the people responsible for destroying your family aren't all dead. Some of them are very much alive, and they're closer to you than you think. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? He handed me one more document from the folder. This one was a private investigator's report, dated just 3 months ago. At the top was a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was Clifford, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize outside what looked like a lawyer's office. The caption below read, "Subject continues regular contact with attorney regarding Harrison estate liquidation." I looked up at Thomas, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known about my son-in-law?" "We've been watching him for 8 years, Philip. Ever since he married your daughter." The room tilted on its axis. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, about who I was, all of it was crumbling around me like a house of cards in a strong wind. But underneath the shock and confusion, something else was beginning to grow. Anger. "Tell me everything," I said. Thomas Donovan moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. "Your father never stopped investigating your disappearance, Philip. What I'm about to show you represents 34 years of detective work, legal research, and patient observation." He spread several documents across his desk like pieces of a puzzle. It started with a family dispute over inheritance. Your grandfather, Charles Harrison, built Harrison Industries from nothing in the 1940s. By the time he died in 1985, the company was worth approximately $50 million. I sat back down, my legs still unsteady. 1985, that's when I was taken. Exactly. Your grandfather's will was very specific. The company and the majority of his wealth were to go to his eldest son, your father, William. But there was a provision. If William died without a male heir reaching adulthood, everything would go to Charles's younger brother, Edmund Harrison. The name meant nothing to me, but Thomas's expression suggested it should. Edmund had 2 children, a son named Marcus and a daughter named Patricia. Both of them stood to inherit massive wealth if your father's bloodline ended. Thomas pulled out a photograph of 2 people I didn't recognize. The man was thin and sharp-featured, with dark hair and cold eyes. The woman beside him had the kind of polished appearance that suggested money and careful grooming, but there was something calculating in her smile. Marcus and Patricia Harrison spent the early 1980s watching their inheritance slip away as your father built a successful marriage and had a son. You represented the end of their financial dreams. "So they decided to make me disappear," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "It was more sophisticated than that. They couldn't simply kill you. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, they found a corrupt social worker named Janet Mills, who specialized in falsifying adoption records for the right price. The plan was elegant in its simplicity." Thomas handed me another document. "On March 15, 1985, you were playing in your backyard while your mother hung laundry on the line. A woman claiming to be from Child Protective Services arrived at your house with official-looking paperwork stating that anonymous reports had been filed alleging abuse. I felt sick. But there was no abuse. Of course not. Your parents were devoted to you. But Janet Mills had perfected the art of manufacturing evidence. She had photographs that appeared to show injuries, witness statements from people who claimed to have seen concerning behavior, medical records that had been altered to suggest previous unreported incidents. The room felt too warm suddenly. How is that possible? Money, Philip. Marcus and Patricia paid Janet Mills $200,000 to build an airtight case against your parents. She'd done it before for other clients who wanted children removed from inconvenient situations. Thomas showed me copies of the falsified reports. Even 38 years later, looking at the lies written about my parents made my hands shake with rage. According to these documents, your father was an alcoholic who became violent when drunk. Your mother was described as mentally unstable, possibly suffering from postpartum depression that had never been treated. None of that was true. Your father never touched alcohol. Your mother was one of the most stable, loving women anyone who knew her ever met. But Janet Mills was very good at her job. She had a network of corrupt doctors, social workers, and even judges who would validate whatever story she needed to tell. I thought about the foster homes I'd been moved through, the feeling of never belonging anywhere, of being told over and over that my parents had been unfit to care for me. What happened after they took me? You were placed in emergency foster care while the state conducted its investigation. But during that time, Janet Mills was busy creating a new identity for you. Your birth certificate was altered to show different parents, people who had actually died in a car accident, giving you a tragic but simple backstory that no one would question too deeply. Thomas pulled out more documents. Your real parents fought the charges, of course. They hired lawyers, demanded investigations, insisted that the evidence was fabricated. But Janet Mills had been careful. Every document looked official. Every witness seemed credible. And your Uncle Marcus used his family's connections to ensure that the case was handled by friendly judges. How long did they fight? 2 years. Your father spent every penny he had on legal fees, hired private investigators, even offered rewards for information about your whereabouts, but you had effectively vanished into the foster care system under a different identity. As far as official records were concerned, Philip Harrison had never existed. The magnitude of what had been done to my family was overwhelming. What happened to the charges against my parents? Eventually, they were dropped. There was no way to maintain the fiction indefinitely, especially with your parents fighting so hard. But by then, you had been adopted by a family in another state under your new identity. Janet Mills made sure you were placed somewhere far enough away that your parents would never accidentally find you. I remembered my adoptive family, the Caldwells. They'd been kind enough, but distant. I'd always felt like they were doing me a favor rather than truly wanting me as their son. Did they know? The people who adopted me? No. They were told you were an orphan whose birth parents had died tragically. They believed they were giving a home to a child who had nowhere else to go. Thomas showed me another photograph, this one of my real parents standing outside a courthouse. My father looked gaunt and exhausted. My mother was crying. This was taken on the day the charges were officially dismissed. By then, they had lost their house, their savings, and their son. Your father had to rebuild Harrison Industries from almost nothing. But he did rebuild it. He did. And he used every penny of profit to fund the search for you. He hired investigators all over the country, set up systems to monitor foster care records, even created a foundation to help other parents whose children had been taken unjustly. The weight of my father's dedication was crushing. While I'd been growing up feeling unwanted and displaced, he'd been fighting to find me. Why didn't he ever find me? Because you legally didn't exist anymore. Philip Harrison had been erased from all official records. The boy in foster care was Philip Caldwell, with a completely different history. There was no paper trail connecting the two identities. Thomas pulled out a final document from the folder. Your father died on June 22nd of last year. Heart attack. The stress of losing you, the years of searching, the guilt of not being able to protect you, it all took its toll. I closed my eyes, feeling tears I hadn't expected. I was working at the hardware store that day. I remember because it was a Tuesday, and we had a big delivery of summer merchandise. I was arranging lawnmowers in the parking lot while my father was dying 200 miles away. He never gave up hope that he would find you, Philip. His will specifies that if you were ever located, the entire Harrison estate should go to you immediately. He also left detailed instructions for exposing the people who destroyed your family, Marcus and Patricia, both dead now. Marcus died in 1998, Patricia in 2006. But they had children, and those children knew the family secret. More importantly, they knew that if you ever resurfaced and reclaimed your inheritance, their own comfortable lives would be over. A terrible suspicion was forming in my mind. What does this have to do with Clifford? Thomas opened the second folder and pulled out a series of surveillance photographs. They showed Clifford meeting with various people over the past several years. Lawyers, private investigators, people in expensive suits having conversations in parking lots and hotel lobbies. Clifford Mason isn't his real name, Philip. He was born Clifford Harrison Mills. His mother was Janet Mills, the social worker who orchestrated your disappearance. His father was Marcus Harrison's illegitimate son, conceived during an affair in the early 1970s. The air left my lungs completely. He's family. He's your cousin, and he's known exactly who you were from the moment he met your daughter. I stared at the photographs, my mind racing. Leah, she doesn't know, does she? We don't believe so. Our investigation suggests that Clifford targeted your daughter specifically because she was your child. He spent months researching her before arranging to meet her. The romance, the marriage, the gradual isolation from you, it was all carefully planned. But why? If Marcus and Patricia are dead, and I never claimed my inheritance, why did he need to do anything? Thomas's expression grew even more serious. Because your father's will was very specific about the timeline. If you weren't located within 5 years of his death, the estate would be donated to charity. But if you were found and then died before claiming it, the inheritance would go to the nearest living Harrison relative. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Clifford, As Marcus Harrison's grandson, he would be the closest surviving family member if you died. But there was a problem. As long as you were alive and well, he couldn't inherit anything. Your existence was a threat to his financial future. I thought about Margaret's sudden illness, how quickly she'd declined, how Clifford had insisted on handling her medical care. My wife, she wasn't sick naturally, was she? Thomas's silence was answer enough. He killed her, I whispered. He killed Margaret to isolate me, to make me more vulnerable. We believe so, but proving it would be almost impossible at this point. He was very careful, very patient. Her death looked natural to everyone, including the doctors. Rage was building in my chest like a physical pressure, and now he's trying to kill me too. Not directly, that would be too suspicious. But if a grieving 63-year-old man became homeless, started drinking, maybe had an accident, or made some other tragic mistake, well, these things happen to people who've lost everything. I stood up again, pacing to the window. Outside, the garden looked peaceful and normal. But inside this office, I was learning that my entire life had been built on lies and orchestrated tragedy. There's something else, Thomas said quietly. The house you've been living in for 37 years? It was purchased with money from your father's estate. Margaret never knew it, but she was actually your father's tenant. He bought the house and arranged for your family to live there so his investigators could keep track of you. I turned back to face him. He knew where I was. He found you when you were 25. But by then, you were married to Margaret and seemed happy. He didn't want to disrupt your life with the truth about your childhood, especially since he had no proof of what Marcus and Patricia had done. So he decided to watch over you from a distance and wait for the right time to reveal himself. But he died before he got the chance. Yes, and that's when Clifford made his move. He'd been monitoring your father's search efforts through his family connections. When William Harrison died, Clifford knew he had a limited window to eliminate you and claim the inheritance. I felt like I was drowning in information, in revelations that reframed every relationship and memory I'd ever had. What am I supposed to do with all this? Thomas reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a set of keys. These are to your father's house. He left it exactly as it was the day you disappeared, hoping you'd come home someday. I think it's time you saw where you really came from. The keys felt heavier than they should have in my palm. And then what? Then you decide what kind of justice your father and your wife deserve. The look in Thomas's eyes told me that Clifford's carefully planned destruction of my life was about to encounter an obstacle he'd never anticipated. The truth, the house was nothing like I'd expected. I'd imagined something grand and imposing, a mansion that would make me feel even more out of place than I already did. Instead, it was a comfortable 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of house where a family might actually live and be happy. Thomas had given me the address and warned me that the house had been maintained, but not updated since my disappearance. Your father wanted everything to be exactly as you'd remember it, he'd said, in case you ever came home. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could work up the courage to use the keys. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined, the kind of place where children rode bicycles and neighbors knew each other's names. It should have felt familiar, but it was like looking at a life that belonged to someone else. The front door opened easily, and the smell that greeted me was devastating in its ordinariness: old wood, furniture polish, and something faintly floral that might have been my mother's perfume. The house was clean but dusty, as if someone had been caring for it but not living in it. The living room was exactly as Thomas had promised, frozen in time. There were toys scattered on the floor, picture books stacked on a coffee table, a small rocking horse positioned near the window. On the mantelpiece, dozens of photographs showed a life I didn't remember but somehow recognized. A young couple holding a baby, a toddler taking his first steps, a 3-year-old boy blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Me. This was my life, the one that had been stolen from me. I picked up one of the photographs, my parents and me at what looked like a park picnic. My father was pushing me on a swing while my mother laughed in the background. They looked so young, so completely happy. The kind of happiness that comes from believing the future is full of nothing but good things. In the kitchen, my mother's coffee mug still sat by the sink, unwashed. A grocery list in her handwriting was stuck to the refrigerator: milk, bread, apples, Philip's favorite cookies. The mundane details of a life interrupted hit me harder than any of the legal documents or surveillance photos had. Upstairs, my childhood bedroom was a shrine to the boy I'd been. Toys arranged on shelves, clothes hanging in a closet, A bed with covers turned down as if my mother had been expecting me to come home for an afternoon nap. On the nightstand was a children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, with a bookmark still marking a page. I sat on the small bed and opened the book. Inside the front cover, my father had written, "For Philip, who will always be the wildest thing of all. Love, Dad." Below that, in my mother's handwriting, "Read to Philip every night until he comes home. Never give up hope." The dates in the margin showed that someone had indeed read this book aloud every night for years after I disappeared. My parents had maintained the ritual, speaking to an empty room, keeping faith that their son would return. By the time I finished exploring the house, I was crying in a way I hadn't since I was a child myself. Not just for what I'd lost, but for what my parents had lost, for the life we should have had together. My phone rang as I sat in my father's study, looking at albums full of pictures documenting the search for me. Police reports, private investigator findings, newspaper clippings about missing children. Decades of desperate hope organized in careful chronological order. "How are you holding up?" Thomas's voice was gentle. "I don't know," I said honestly. "This is all so much to process." "I understand, but Philip, there's something else you need to see. Something we discovered about Clifford's timeline that changes everything." "What do you mean?" "Can you meet me back at the office? I think it's better if I show you in person." An hour later, I was back in Thomas's office, feeling like I'd aged years in the space of a single day. He had new documents spread across his desk, these ones clearly more recent. "We've been monitoring Clifford's communications for the past 8 years, he said without preamble. "What I'm about to show you will be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what he's done." He handed me a series of printed emails. "These are from Clifford to various members of his extended family, starting from 2014, a year before he married your daughter." I read the first email, dated March 10th, 2014. "Uncle Robert, I've located the target. He's been living under the name Philip Caldwell for 30 years, married with one daughter. The daughter, Leah, age 30, works as a teacher and appears to be emotionally vulnerable following a recent divorce. I'm going to make contact through a professional development workshop she's attending next month. The timeline should work perfectly if I can establish a relationship quickly." My hands were shaking as I read, "Target." He'd referred to me as a target. Thomas handed me another email, this one from July of the same year. "The daughter is more susceptible than expected. She has significant abandonment issues from her divorce and a complicated relationship with her father. She sees him as weak and disappointing. This actually works in our favor. I've convinced her that she deserves better than the life her parents modeled for her. The romance is progressing ahead of schedule." I felt sick reading about my daughter being manipulated, analyzed, like a chess piece in someone else's game. She really doesn't know who he is. Keep reading. The next email was from December 2014. "Engagement successful. Leah believes I'm everything her ex-husband wasn't. Stable, ambitious, reliable. She's already started pulling away from her parents, just as planned. The father, Philip, is exactly what we expected. Passive, working class, no ambition. He won't be a problem. The mother might be more difficult. She's sharper than her husband and doesn't trust me yet. But she loves her daughter and won't interfere if she thinks it will hurt Leah's happiness. Margaret." He'd seen my wife as an obstacle from the beginning. Thomas showed me more emails, spanning years. I watched my family's destruction unfold in cold, calculated language. Clifford documenting how he gradually turned Leah against me, how he identified Margaret's weak points, how he planned to isolate me completely. "This one is from 3 years ago," Thomas said, handing me another printout. "Right around the time Margaret first started getting sick. Robert, the mother-in-law is becoming suspicious of some of my business activities. She's been asking questions about my background and seems to be doing some research of her own. This could become a problem if she discovers the truth about my identity. I think it's time to implement the final phase of the plan. I've been researching medications that could accelerate certain health conditions. It needs to look natural, but it also needs to be relatively quick. I can't risk her exposing everything when we're so close to the finish line." I set the email down, my vision blurring with rage. He murdered my wife because she was getting too close to the truth. It appears so. And here's the final email, sent just 3 weeks ago. This one was short but chilling. "The old man is now completely isolated and vulnerable. Wife is dead, daughter is fully under my control, and he has no support system left. I'm going to accelerate the timeline and get him out of the house this week. Once he's homeless and desperate, It shouldn't take long for him to have some kind of accident or breakdown. Then we can finally claim what should have been ours all along. Thomas pulled out one more document. This is a life insurance policy Clifford took out on you 18 months ago, listing himself as the beneficiary. He claimed you asked him to handle your financial affairs as your mental state declined. But I never signed anything like that. No, but Leah did, as your power of attorney, granted when Margaret was dying and you were supposedly too grief-stricken to handle paperwork. She thought she was helping you by delegating financial decisions to her husband. The scope of the manipulation was breathtaking. Clifford had spent years positioning himself to legally control my life and death, all while making my own daughter complicit in the process. There's more, Thomas said quietly. We've also discovered that this isn't the first time Clifford's family has done something like this. His mother, Janet Mills, destroyed at least 6 other families over her career. Always for money, always with the same careful planning. He showed me a file containing other cases, other children who'd been removed from loving homes and placed into the system under false pretenses, other families torn apart by manufactured evidence and corrupt officials. It's a generational business model, Thomas explained. Clifford learned from his mother how to identify vulnerable targets and systematically destroy their lives for financial gain. You weren't his first victim, Philip. You were just his biggest score. I thought about Leah, about how proud she'd been when she introduced Clifford to us. How convinced she'd been that she'd found someone who would take care of her. My daughter really has no idea what he is. Based on our surveillance, no. She genuinely believes she married someone who loves her. She has no idea that her entire relationship was a carefully planned fraud designed to destroy her father's life. What about after? Once I'm dead and he inherits everything, what happens to Leah? Thomas's expression darkened. We found drafts of divorce papers on his computer, filed but not submitted. Our best guess is that once he has access to your inheritance, he'll leave her. Probably claim that grief over your death made him realize they wanted different things in life. So my daughter would lose her father and her husband, all while never knowing that the man she'd trusted had orchestrated both tragedies. There's one more thing, Thomas said. Something that might change how you want to handle this situation. He handed me a medical report. This is from Margaret's doctor, from her final weeks. He noted some unusual symptoms that didn't quite fit her official diagnosis, but he didn't pursue it because her decline seemed consistent with her age and stress level. I scanned the report. What am I looking for? The medications in her system. Some of them weren't prescribed by any of her doctors, and the levels suggest they were administered over several months, in doses carefully calculated to worsen her condition without causing immediate suspicion. My hands clenched into fists. He poisoned her slowly. We believe so, but proving it would be nearly impossible without exhuming her body and running extensive tests. Even then, the evidence might not be conclusive enough for a criminal prosecution. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where everything appeared normal and peaceful. But inside this office, I was learning about a level of evil I'd never imagined possible. So, what are my options? I asked. Clifford has destroyed my family, murdered my wife, manipulated my daughter, and stolen my entire life. But you're telling me the legal system can't touch him? The legal system moves slowly and requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. But there are other kinds of justice, Philip. Other ways to ensure that someone pays for what they've done. I turned back to face Thomas. What do you mean? His smile was cold and calculating. I mean that Clifford has made one crucial mistake in all his careful planning. He thinks you're a broken, powerless old man with nowhere to turn. He has no idea that you now know the truth about who you really are. Thomas pulled out one final document. Bank account information showing numbers that still made my head spin. You're not Philip Caldwell, the hardware store employee with $63 in his checking account. You're Philip Harrison, heir to a fortune worth over $200 million. And I think it's time Clifford learned the difference. The look in Thomas's eyes promised that my son-in-law's carefully orchestrated plan was about to encounter a very unpleasant surprise. The plan Thomas and I developed was elegant in its simplicity. Clifford expected a broken, desperate man who would either disappear quietly or self-destruct in a way that would look accidental. Instead, he was going to get exactly what he thought he wanted, but with consequences he'd never anticipated. I spent 3 days at my father's house going through decades of documents and learning about the man I'd never had the chance to know. William Harrison had been methodical in his record-keeping, documenting every lead in the search for his son, every dead end, every moment of hope and disappointment. But more than that, he'd been preparing. In his study, I found detailed files on Marcus and Patricia Harrison, on Janet Mills, and on several other people who'd been involved in my disappearance. My father had built cases against all of them, gathering evidence that would have been devastating if he'd lived to use it. He'd even identified Clifford as a potential threat years before my son-in-law had made his move. Your father was a patient man, Thomas had told me as we reviewed the files. He understood that justice sometimes requires waiting for the right moment. That moment had finally arrived. On Thursday morning, I drove my old Toyota back to the house I'd been thrown out of less than a week earlier. The car was loaded with the same garbage bags Clifford had packed for me, but now they contained carefully selected items from my father's house, old clothes, a few worthless knickknacks, and some documents that would tell the right story if anyone looked through them. I parked across the street and sat there for 20 minutes watching the house. Clifford's BMW was in the driveway, which meant he was working from home. Leah's car was gone. She'd be at school, teaching her third-grade class, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. When I finally walked up to the front door, I made sure to look exactly like what Clifford expected to see. Defeated, exhausted, maybe a little desperate. I'd slept in my car for 2 nights to make sure I looked rough enough to be believable. Clifford answered the door after the third knock, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been disappointment. He'd probably been hoping I wouldn't come back at all. "Philip," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you and Leah," I said, letting my voice crack slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said about learning to live alone. Maybe you were right." Something shifted in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or relief. "Leah's at work, but we can talk." He stepped aside to let me in, and I noticed how he positioned himself between me and the rest of the house, like he was controlling my access to my own former home. The living room looked different already. Margaret's photographs had been moved, her favorite chair repositioned. They were erasing her presence piece by piece. "You look terrible," Clifford said, settling into his chair like he owned the place, which legally he probably did. "Have you been sleeping?" "In the car, mostly. A motel for one night, but it was too expensive. I let him see me count the bills in my wallet. $37, all that remained of my original 63. I think I made a mistake trying to be independent. I'm not as strong as I thought I was." Clifford leaned back, and I could practically see him calculating. This was going exactly as he'd planned. "What are you saying, Philip?" "I'm saying maybe you and Leah were right. Maybe I do need help figuring out what to do next. I don't have anywhere to go, and I'm not getting any younger." "That's a big change from your attitude last week." I shrugged, trying to look embarrassed. "Pride is a luxury I can't afford anymore. I've been driving around, looking at apartments I can't afford, thinking about what Margaret would want me to do. She'd want me to swallow my pride and ask my family for help." The word family made something predatory flash in Clifford's eyes. "What kind of help are you talking about?" "I don't know. Maybe I could stay in the guest room for a little while, just until I figure out my next step. I could pay rent, not much, but something. I could help around the house, do maintenance work." Clifford was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking through the angles. A desperate Philip living under his roof would be much easier to control than a homeless Philip wandering around town. Easier to monitor, easier to manipulate, and easier to arrange an accident for when the time was right. "I'd have to talk to Leah," he said finally. "This is her house too." "Of course, I understand." I paused, then played my strongest card. "I know I haven't been the father she deserved. I was always working, always letting Margaret handle the emotional stuff. Maybe this is a chance for me to do better, to be more involved in her life." That sealed it. The last thing Clifford wanted was for Leah and me to rebuild our relationship, but he couldn't say that without revealing his true motivations. Instead, he'd have to agree to let me stay while working to keep us apart. "The guest room is pretty small," he said, as if he was doing me a tremendous favor. "I don't need much space, just somewhere to sleep while I get back on my feet." When Leah came home that evening, Clifford had already prepared her for the conversation. I could see it in the way she looked at me. Pity mixed with reluctance, like she was being asked to take in a stray dog she wasn't sure she wanted. "Dad, Clifford told me you want to stay here for a while." "Only if it's not too much trouble, sweetheart." I know you and Clifford have your own life, and I don't want to be in the way. She glanced at her husband, and I saw him give her a small nod. Permission? It made my stomach turn to watch my own daughter seek approval from the man who'd murdered her mother. I guess it would be okay, she said slowly, temporarily, until you find your own place. Thank you. I reached out to hug her, and for a moment she felt like my little girl again. But then she stiffened and pulled away, and I remembered that Clifford had spent years teaching her to see affection from me as weakness. That night, I lay in the guest room, my own guest room, in the house I'd lived in for 37 years, and listened to Clifford and Leah talking in their bedroom. The walls were thin enough that I could make out most of their conversation. I don't like this, Leah was saying. He seems different, more needy. Grief affects people in different ways. Clifford replied, his voice patient and understanding. He's probably realizing for the first time how much he depended on your mother. It's actually kind of sad. How long do you think he'll want to stay? Not long. Men like your father don't do well with change. He'll either find his independence again or, Clifford's voice trailed off meaningfully, or what? Or he'll realize that some people aren't meant to live alone. Your mother took care of everything for him, Leah. Without her, he's like a child trying to navigate the adult world. I had to bite my tongue to keep from responding. Clifford was painting me as pathetic and helpless, setting up a narrative that would make my eventual accident seem inevitable rather than suspicious. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I was grateful for every meal, apologetic about every inconvenience, and careful to seem just confused enough about basic life skills to reinforce Clifford's story. I asked Leah for help with things like setting up a bank account and understanding Medicare paperwork, things any competent adult should be able to handle alone. But while I was acting helpless, I was also gathering information. Clifford's home office was just down the hall from the guest room, and he was careless about securing his computer when he thought he was alone in the house with a harmless old man. During the hours when both he and Leah were at work, I photographed financial documents, copied email addresses, and documented his communications with his extended family. What I found was even worse than Thomas and I had suspected. Clifford hadn't just been planning my death, he'd been actively arranging it. He'd researched my medical history, identified my prescription medications, and calculated dosages that would cause what would appear to be an accidental overdose. He'd even practiced forging my handwriting, apparently planning to leave behind a suicide note expressing guilt over being a burden to my daughter. The timeline was aggressive. Based on his communications, Clifford was planning to implement his final solution within 2 weeks of my return to the house. He'd already scheduled time off from work, ostensibly to help Leah deal with her father's declining mental state. But the most chilling discovery was a draft email to his family, dated for the day after my planned death. Uncle Robert, the situation has been resolved. The old man suffered what appears to be an accidental overdose of his heart medication, complicated by alcohol consumption. Leah found him this morning and is devastated, but she understands that he'd been struggling with depression since her mother's death. The funeral will be small and private. I should have access to the inheritance within 60 days of probate. Finally, after all these years, justice for what was stolen from our family. Justice. The word made me sick. In Clifford's mind, he was righting a historical wrong rather than committing murder. I photographed everything and sent it to Thomas through an encrypted email account he'd set up for me. Within hours, he responded with a single word: ready. The trap was set. Clifford thought he was closing in on his final victory, but he had no idea that every move he'd made had been anticipated and documented. More importantly, he had no idea that the broken old man sleeping in his guest room was actually one of the wealthiest men in the state, with resources he couldn't begin to imagine. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd returned to the house, Clifford made his first real mistake. He came home from work carrying a small paper bag from the pharmacy, and when he thought I wasn't looking, he slipped something from that bag into his jacket pocket. I knew what it was. The additional medication he planned to use to ensure my accidental overdose would be fatal. He was moving ahead with his timeline, probably planning to implement his solution over the weekend when he'd have uninterrupted time to stage the scene. That night, I called Thomas from the guest room bathroom, speaking in whispers. "He's accelerating," I said. "I think it's going to happen tomorrow. Are you ready?" I thought about my father, who'd spent 34 years searching for a son who'd been stolen from him. I thought about Margaret, slowly poisoned by a man she'd trusted as family. I thought about Leah, manipulated and controlled by someone who saw her as nothing more than a tool for accessing my inheritance. "I'm ready," I said. Then tomorrow, Clifford Harrison Mills learns what happens when you destroy the wrong family. As I hung up the phone, I could hear Clifford moving around in the kitchen below, probably preparing whatever concoction he planned to use to kill me. He thought he was so close to victory that he could practically taste it. He had no idea that tomorrow would be the day his entire world collapsed around him. And unlike the gradual, subtle destruction he'd visited on my family, his reckoning was going to be swift, public, and absolutely devastating. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything feel muted and somber. Perfect, I thought, for what Clifford had planned. He'd probably chosen this weekend specifically because the gloomy atmosphere would make my supposed suicide seem more believable. Leah left early for a teacher's workshop that would keep her away until evening. I watched from the guest room window as she backed out of the driveway, completely unaware that her husband had planned for this to be the last time she'd see her father alive. Clifford waited exactly 30 minutes after she left before knocking on my door. "Philip, are you awake? I made coffee." His voice was different today, warmer, more solicitous. The voice of a caring son-in-law spending quality time with his grieving father-in-law. I knew he was establishing an emotional baseline for the witnesses he'd need later. "I'll be right down," I called back, making my voice sound tired and slightly confused. In the kitchen, Clifford had prepared what looked like a genuinely nice breakfast. Eggs, toast, bacon, fresh orange juice. If I hadn't known what he was planning, I might have been touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," I said, sitting down at the table. "It's no trouble at all. I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be a better father to Leah. I thought maybe we could talk about that." He settled across from me with his own plate, but I noticed he barely touched his food. Too nervous, probably. Or maybe he was saving his appetite for the celebration he'd planned for later. "I brought you something," he continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small prescription bottle. "I noticed you've been having trouble sleeping. These are mild sedatives. They'll help you rest without making you groggy during the day." I took the bottle and examined it. The label showed my name and a prescription for a common sleep aid, but the pills inside looked slightly different from what I'd expect, larger, with a different color and marking. "Dr. Peterson prescribed these?" I asked, naming Margaret's former doctor. "He thought they might help with your anxiety about the future. Just take 2 with your morning coffee. They work better with caffeine." 2 pills that weren't actually sedatives, washed down with coffee that probably contained additional medication. Clifford had planned this carefully, creating a scenario where my death would look like an accident caused by an elderly man's confusion about his prescriptions. "That's very thoughtful," I said, setting the bottle beside my coffee cup. "I have been having trouble sleeping. Grief is exhausting," Clifford agreed, his voice full of false sympathy. "It's important to take care of yourself, especially now that you don't have Margaret to look after you." We made small talk for 20 minutes while I ate breakfast, and he pretended to eat his. The conversation felt surreal. 2 men discussing the weather and current events, while one planned to murder the other before noon. Finally, Clifford glanced at his watch. "You should probably take those pills soon. Dr. Peterson said they work best if you take them early in the day." "Of course." I opened the bottle and shook 2 pills into my palm. They were definitely not what the label claimed. These were larger and had markings I didn't recognize. "Should I take them with food? Coffee is fine. The caffeine actually helps the absorption." I lifted the pills toward my mouth, then paused. "You know, I should probably call Dr. Peterson's office first. I'm taking heart medication, and I want to make sure there aren't any interactions." Clifford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Philip, Dr. Peterson prescribed these specifically for you. He already knows about your other medications." "I know, but Margaret always said I should double-check these things. She was very careful about drug interactions." "Margaret was overly cautious about everything," Clifford said, and for the first time I heard genuine irritation in his voice. "These are mild sedatives, not chemotherapy. Just take them." His mask was starting to slip. The patient, caring son-in-law was being replaced by someone harder and more demanding. Someone who needed me to take those pills right now. "You're right," I said, putting the pills back in my mouth. Margaret did worry too much about everything. I lifted the coffee cup to my lips, paused, then set it down again. "Actually, could I get some water instead? Coffee makes me jittery sometimes." Clifford stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Philip, just take the damn pills." There it was. The real Clifford. The one who'd spent 8 years manipulating my daughter and planning my murder. The one who'd slowly poisoned my wife and then comforted my daughter through her grief. I looked at him calmly and set the pills down on the table. "No." "What?" I said no, Clifford. Or should I call you by your real name, Clifford Harrison Mills? The color drained from his face completely. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then his hand darted toward the knife block on the counter. I wouldn't, I said quietly. Thomas Donovan has been watching this house since 6 this morning. If anything happens to me, you'll have a lot of explaining to do. Clifford's hand froze halfway to the knives. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. You know exactly who Thomas Donovan is because you've been monitoring his investigation into your family for years. Just like you've been monitoring the search for Philip Harrison, your cousin, the son of William Harrison, heir to a fortune worth over $200 million. I stood up slowly, and Clifford backed away from me like I was dangerous, which I supposed I finally was. Your grandmother Janet Mills was very thorough when she erased Philip Harrison from existence, I continued. But she made one mistake. She assumed that William Harrison would eventually give up looking for his son. She didn't count on a father's love being stronger than her bureaucratic fraud. Clifford's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. You're Philip Caldwell. You work in a hardware store. You have $63 in your checking account. I had $63. As of yesterday, I have considerably more. I pulled out my phone and showed him a bank balance that made his eyes widen. Turns out inheriting $200 million really improves your financial situation. The blood was rushing back to his face now, but it was the red of anger rather than the pale of shock. Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. You can't prove anything about Margaret, and Leah will never believe you. She loves me. Leah loves the man she thinks you are. She has no idea she married the grandson of the woman who destroyed her father's childhood. She doesn't know you've been planning to murder me and leave her a widow. And she definitely doesn't know about these. I pulled out copies of his emails to his family, the ones documenting his plan to kill me and claim my inheritance. His face went completely white again as he recognized his own words. How did you? Your computer security is terrible, Clifford, almost as bad as your operational security. Did you really think you could spend 8 years planning to murder someone without leaving any evidence? He lunged for the emails, but I was ready for him. At 63, I might not have been as fast as I used to be, but I was a lot more motivated than he'd expected. Thomas, I called out. The front door opened immediately, and Thomas Donovan walked in with 2 men I didn't recognize. They moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested law enforcement background. Gentlemen, Thomas said calmly, I'd like you to meet Clifford Harrison Mills, also known as Clifford Mason. He's wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Margaret Harrison and the planned murder of Philip Harrison. One of the men stepped forward with handcuffs. Clifford Harrison Mills, you're under arrest. Clifford looked back and forth between us, his mind clearly racing through options. This is insane. You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial. Actually, Thomas said, pulling out a recording device, we have quite a bit of proof, including your confession from this morning. The device had been recording our entire breakfast conversation. Clifford's attempts to pressure me into taking the pills, his knowledge of my medical history, his familiarity with drug interactions, all of it was documented. As they led Clifford away, he looked back at me with pure hatred. Leah will never forgive you for this. She'll never believe you over me. Maybe, I said, but at least she'll be alive to make that choice. Thomas and I stood in the kitchen after the police car disappeared down the street. The breakfast dishes were still on the table, the poisoned pills scattered beside my coffee cup like evidence of a life that had almost ended. How are you feeling? Thomas asked. I thought about it for a moment. Empty, but not in a bad way. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I forgot what it felt like to put it down. And Leah? That was the hardest part. My daughter would be coming home to find her husband arrested, her father revealed as someone completely different from who she'd thought he was, and her entire life exposed as a lie constructed by a man who'd never loved her. She's going to hate me, I said, at least at first. Clifford spent years convincing her that I was weak and disappointing. Learning the truth about him doesn't automatically undo 8 years of manipulation. But it's a start. Thomas was right. It was a start. Not the happy reunion I might have fantasized about, but the beginning of a possibility that Leah and I might someday have a real relationship based on truth instead of the lies Clifford had fed her. 3 hours later, I was sitting in my father's study when Leah called. Her voice was shaky and confused. Dad? The police called me. They said Clifford's been arrested. They said there are things about him I don't know. What's happening? Come to this address, I said, giving her the location of my father's house. There are some things I need to show you, some things about our family that you deserve to know. When she arrived, I was waiting on the front porch of the house where I'd lived the first 3 years of my life. Leah looked fragile and lost, like someone whose entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. "Whose house is this?" she asked. "Ours," I said simply. "This is where you would have grown up if some very bad people hadn't decided to steal it from us." I told her everything about William Harrison and the fortune that should have been her grandfather, about Janet Mills and the conspiracy that had destroyed our family before she was born, about Clifford's real identity and his plan to murder me for money she'd never known existed. She cried when I showed her the photographs of her real grandparents, the family she'd never had the chance to know. She was angry when she read Clifford's emails documenting how he'd manipulated her emotions and isolated her from me. But mostly, she was quiet, processing revelations that reframed every relationship and memory she'd ever had. "I feel so stupid," she said finally. 8 years of marriage to a man who never loved me. 8 years of believing you were this weak, disappointing person when you were actually... "I was actually exactly what I appeared to be," I said gently. "A hardware store employee who loved his wife and daughter and never knew he was anything more than that. The money doesn't change who I am, Leah. It just changes what I can do." As the sun set behind the trees in my father's backyard, Leah and I sat on the porch where William Harrison had once played with his 3-year-old son. We were both grieving, her for the husband who'd never existed, me for the decades with my father I'd never have. But we were grieving together, and that felt like something we could build on. 6 months later, I donated most of the Harrison fortune to organizations that helped families destroyed by corrupt social services and fraudulent adoptions. I kept enough to ensure Leah and I would never want for anything, but wealth had never been the point. The point was justice. The point was truth. The point was finally being free to live as the person I really was, instead of the broken remnant Clifford had tried to turn me into. Clifford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence against him was overwhelming once investigators knew where to look. They found traces of the medication he'd used to kill Margaret, documentation of his plans to murder me, and connections to several other suspicious deaths in his extended family over the years. Leah visits him sometimes, not because she forgives him, but because she says she needs to understand how someone could fake love so convincingly for so long. I think she's trying to rebuild her ability to trust, starting with the hardest case possible. As for me, I live quietly in my father's house now, surrounded by the childhood I can't remember but somehow recognize. I tend the garden my mother planted, read the books my father collected, and sleep in the room where Philip Harrison was supposed to grow up. I'm not the man I would have been if my family hadn't been destroyed. But I'm no longer the broken remnant Clifford tried to create either. I'm something new. Something that never existed before. A man who knows exactly what he's lost and exactly what he's gained, and who's finally free to decide what to do with both. And for the first time in 63 years, that feels like enough.